Two people coming in. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this fifth installment of our Policy Dialogue series with Professor Anthony Chung. So today's topic is on the Constraint City, livability, mobility, connectivity, and sustainability. It reminds me very much of this very famous report that was published in 1972 by the Club of Rome on, it was called The Limits to Growth, which really, for the first time, I think, made the argument that, you know, in a world of exponential economic and population growth, where we have finite resources, eventually we're going to hit those limits to growth. So we're going to speak about those limits and those constraints in the context of Hong Kong's urban development. And again, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our Policy Dialogue speaker, Professor Anthony Chung, whom I'm sure most of you would be familiar with. He's currently the Research Chair Professor for Public Administration at EdUHK, also an Adjunct Professor at the Division of Public Policy at UST. But of course, you know, he's most well known as the former Secretary for Transport and Housing in the Hong Kong SAR government. So over to you, Anthony.
Thank you, Donald. As you said, in this dialogue, we are going to examine Hong Kong in terms of growth, limitations to growth, the constraints that Hong Kong is in. And in my former incarnation as Secretary for Transport Housing, I mean, as you can see, in terms of housing and transport, basically I was dealing with issues relating to limitations in growth, constraints in space and development. And this issue of constraint is a very big topic. So in my presentation, I'm trying to explain what constraints we are talking about and what kind of situation Hong Kong is in terms of it being a constraint city. Now, in terms of growth, Hong Kong has many achievements, economic achievements. By and large, we are an affluent city overall. Of course, the disparity, social disparity, wealth disparity has become bigger in recent years. And housing, which we talked about in the last policy dialogue, has always been a very challenging problem for Hong Kong, and all the more in recent years. We are well known internationally for our high quality infrastructure, for our high degree of domestic mobility and external connectivity. But then there's also the observation that we are facing constraints in terms of infrastructure development. Hong Kong is having very high standard in terms of urban planning. We adopt most international standards. Our land use is highly regulated. However, there's also the criticism that perhaps we are falling behind in terms of planning and land use to suit the latest social and economic needs. In terms of innovation, nowadays we are talking about turning Hong Kong into a smart city or a smarter city. But compared to other cities, big cities in the world, and also within the region, there is the criticism that we are probably still behind them. We are a late starter, so to speak. So there is real concern about Hong Kong's long-term sustainability in an overall sense, in terms of growth, economic growth, social growth, bill structure, quality of living, and also competitiveness. So this is the starting point. And in a way, Hong Kong is at a critical juncture. Now, all the achievements we have made in the past, I think somehow have turned some of us, including those in government, in business, everywhere, into a mindset that is so fond of the past, in a way becoming victim of our own past success, because we have achieved so much to the extent that we feel that the ways forward have to be very carefully crafted now. So we have become more risk-averse. We have become less daring, so to speak, compared to 2 or 3 decades ago. And some other cities, which in the past used to learn from Hong Kong, which are behind Hong Kong, some of them have surpassed Hong Kong in certain aspects. So the big question is whether Hong Kong is falling behind the curve, especially in terms of innovation and technology, in terms of smart city. Now, let me first of all deal with the question of constraint. Now, I'm here quoting Charles Ames, who is a very well-known industrial designer of the US, and he was, in fact, called one of the greatest designers of the 20th century. Now, he, of course, I'm just quoting him in a casual sense. I'm not using what he said to describe Hong Kong, but he refers to Los Angeles, LA, as a city without constraints, in the sense that they just go. There's no restrictions. So in a way, you can say it's chaos. But in another sense, the city has grown out of those unplanned, or rather unrestricted developments. So when we say growth, we can make a distinction between growth under planning and growth without planning, or chaos in a positive sense. But nowadays, most cities would emphasize the importance of planning. And planning implies objectives, planning implies restrictions, planning implies regulation. And if there's too much regulation, we can argue that then, yes, whatever growth you can achieve will be according to plan and therefore subject to restriction, and there's less chaos. But at the same time, maybe growth in a more chaotic sense would add more colors. And Donald, before we started this session, we talked about Wan Chai in Hong Kong. And Wan Chai is an area which most of the time has grown out of chaos, in quotation. Of course, nowadays there's more planning. So when we talk about constraints, we are not just talking about physical constraints or planning constraints. We may be also talking about other aspects of states, other aspects of possibilities, opportunities that a city can take advantage of in terms of growth in an overall sense. And there is a theory of constraints, and it's borrowed from industrial production. TOC, a theory of constraints, originated in the 1970s, and essentially is about how to optimize production. And there has always been recognition that whatever operations we undertake, there's bound to be constraints. We have goals, objectives, but we face constraints. So the challenge then is how do you maximize the number of objectives that you can achieve? So in other words, the degree of achievement versus constraints you're facing, whether you're able to reduce the number of constraints. And constraints could be physical, constraints could be invisible or less tangible. So the question then is, if you are operating within an environment of constraints, the management challenge is, first of all, you recognize the constraints. Secondly, you minimize the constraints, and therefore you are able to enhance your production to a high level. Now, the same kind of challenge also applies to managing a city, or nowadays we used to say governance, urban governance. So it's a kind of management. So when you manage a city, you want to ensure that the city would continue to thrive. You want the city to continue to be exciting, to be interesting, to fulfill the needs of various stakeholders in society. So you have, first of all, to recognize constraints, because constraints are part of the given for any city. So we are not imagining that you could have a city without constraints. Then the question is, what kind of constraints you are facing? Are these constraints real constraints in the sense that they really hinder whatever you want to achieve? Or some of the constraints can be overcome, some of the constraints can be minimized, and you're able to optimize the situation so that you can achieve maximum growth in the overall sense. Now, in my last bullet here on the slide, I say, this is a quote from somewhere, a chain is no stronger than its weakest link. So we are talking about chain, an iron chain or steel chain. So in the real world, there's no change without its weakest link. There's always a weakest link. So if you can identify the weakest link, if you can focus on what could be termed as vital constraints, then you are much closer to achieving growth, achieving sustainability. Now, coming to the urban setting, if you want to have growth, sustainability, then you need to ensure that there is resilience. Resilience to withstand challenge, to overcome constraints, to release potential. And so the definition of resilience is, according to some authors, the ability to absorb, adapt, and respond to changes in an urban system. And I think this is a very useful definition, because it does not presume the absence of challenge and constraints or hurdles. So the ability to absorb changes, the ability to adapt to changes. So you are responding to some given situation, some features in the situation. So how do you respond? How do you absorb those challenges? And you can make a distinction between social resilience, economic resilience, institutional resilience, infrastructural resilience, community resilience, or what we can describe as community or social capital. So there are various aspects of resilience we are talking about. And to develop resilience, an urban system has to manage natural, technological, economic, and human stresses. Now, a stressor is refers to strain, tension in the system. So what we essentially are talking about is any urban system, any social system is cannot be devoid of stresses, constraints. So then the challenge to urban planning, the challenge to urban governance is how do you factor in those stresses? How do you overcome constraints? How do you maximize the opportunity for growth? Now, so this is the sort of conceptual setting I would like to make before we look at Hong Kong. Before I come to Hong Kong, another slide on the various types of constraints, and I just try to be to show the wide range of constraints that we can be talking about. This is not an exhaustive list. So geographical constraints in terms of land, natural resources, spatial constraints, and then population constraints due to demographic structure, whether we are an aging society or we have a high proportion of young people full of energy, productive power in terms of education, in terms of sort of natural endowment, and then economic and resource constraints, economic growth, fiscal capacity, education, skills, talent, whether society is in harmony or in great conflict, social capital, and then planning constraints. Planning can be positive and sort of negative. Positive in the sense that if we plan appropriately, we maximize the use of space, land, and other natural resources, our ecosystem. But it could be negative in the sense that if we overplan to the extent of overregulation, if we plan inappropriately, then we restrict the potential of how we can make the best use of whatever resources we have. So ultimately, it's about balancing. And technological constraints, R&D, investment, innovation, application, and the sort of stage of technological advancement we are in. And systemic constraints, the overall system, governance capacity, leadership, politics, and I have also added NIMBYism, the kind of community mindset we are in, whether we are very self-centered, whether we are not thinking of others, not in my backyard kind of mentality. Now, these categories and types of constraints are shown on the slide. They are just for illustrative purpose. I'm not going to them in my presentation, but just to let us be aware of the wide range of constraints any city is facing. Now, in the case of Hong Kong, I just want to go through some of the advantages and constraints we're in so that we have a better picture, better idea of where our city lies. Geographical, locational advantage. We are in a very good location. We have a natural deep harbor. From Hong Kong, if you take a plane, within 4 hours journey, we can reach most of the thriving economies of Asia. So we are well located, and as property agents like to say, location, 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 and we are, have this locational advantage. But at the same time, we have geographical limitations. We don't have a lot of natural resources. We have to depend a lot. We are an externally oriented economy. We have the mainly advantage in terms of location. But at the same time, as we all know, in Hong Kong, some of our people have hesitation about GBA, Greater Bay Area integration for various reasons. In terms of economic and fiscal constraints or advantages, we have a very decent level of fiscal surplus, although that surplus is fast depleting over the last 2 years, partly because of COVID-19. The government has to roll out a range of packages to provide relief and support. But our economic base is rather narrow, as many critics have said. And we are facing intense regional competition. So whatever advantages we have can be looked at in another angle as potential constraints and limitations. In terms of human capital, well-educated, social harmony dialogue until the last 2 years because of the political tension. But some would say that our society is becoming more divisive. Nimbism is on the rise. We have professional talent from all over the world and the mainland of China. This is part of Hong Kong's history. We welcome people from everywhere. But increasingly, our society is also becoming inward-looking. And there is professional protectionism. We want to protect local professionals. We have world-class universities with strong basic research. And at the same time, we are lacking in application and innovation because we don't have a large manufacturing base. So sometimes research expertise can find nowhere to be applied to actual industry and development. We have an aging population, and which can be seen as either a burden or a form of new assets. Okay, so these are some of the challenges, and then in terms of built environment, we have high quality of infrastructure, but we fall behind demands and needs, and our projects have become more expensive, and the time taken for development has become longer for various reasons. Housing supply and affordability, that is an issue we have examined in the last dialogue. And land, we have a lot of land, but not every piece of land can be developed, whether physically or in terms of planned use. So developable land is not catching up with our social and economic needs. Land use control, according to world standard, yes, we have a very efficient and high standard in terms of land use control, but there are critics who would suggest that are we overplanned as a city? Accessibility. The city is highly mobile overall, and we can go anywhere within the city, but we face growing congestion. Connectivity, again, a very high level of connectivity, whether regionally or globally, but we also face constraints in terms of infrastructure development, in terms of growing congestion that eats into public space. Governance, according to the World Bank's global governance indicators, Hong Kong has scored very high marks in terms of government effectiveness, regulatory quality. But there's also the observation that our system has become increasingly risk-averse and insufficiently responsive to changing needs in society. Leadership is something that is subject to examination in Hong Kong over the last couple of years because of the political crisis, because of COVID-19. And here I'm not just talking about government leadership, but leadership could be looked at in a broader sense in terms of how government can act in alignment with society, work together with business. So we are talking about leadership for the system as a whole. And finally, sustainability. There is criticism that Hong Kong is not green enough, not smart enough. So these will be further taken up by Christine Low and also Chris Hartley. So this is a very quick run-through of Hong Kong's list of advantages, achievements, as well as hurdles, constraints, and possible vulnerabilities. And I will sum up Hong Kong's key bottlenecks by the four L's, the letter L. First of all, no particular sequence of importance. They're all important. Land. So this is quite obvious. Labor in the process, not just physical labor, but skills, expertise, professional talent, intelligence, meaning how educated our society overall is, whether we are a society that's able to learn, to enhance our understanding of things. The third L refers to leadership, government, business, civil society. And the last L, looking ahead, in the sense of vision, foresight, the ability to anticipate. And planning, in a way, denotes the capacity to anticipate, because it's plan for the future and learn and innovate. Now, many of these keywords have been common catchwords in management literature, in innovation and technology literature, in governance literature. So we are just repeating what is already well known in our understanding of growth and governance. But it is important that we use these four L's to appraise Hong Kong. If we are talking about a constraint city, how can we overcome constraint? How can we turn constraints, challenges into opportunities? And we cannot afford to just stay as a victim of past success, or in Cantonese, most local. So that's a big challenge. Now, I'm not going too deep into each of the main aspects of the constraints, but just to highlight some of the important points so that we can think more fully and deeply. In terms of built environment, there's always the temptation that when we face the limitation in the shortage of housing, the limitation in public space, we would say, okay, maybe there's too much planning, maybe there's not enough land, so on and so forth. But I would like to introduce an additional angle, which is very important: politics. Now, politics is a summation of social behavior or different interests in society. It reflects that kind of configuration. So, and I'm quoting from two sources so that we can focus on the issues. First, the myth of the land constraint city. We don't have enough land. So this is quote here: even if a city is geographically constrained, it can tear down low density uses and build higher. So constraints against new housing are political, not geographical. Now, of course, this is pushing things to the extreme, but there's a bit of wisdom in this quotation. So can we turn around things? Instead of having low-rise construction, maybe high-rise construction can be one answer. And I think both Singapore and Hong Kong have been doing that over the last past century. And another quote is, affordability is a matter of being an expensive, versus an expensive, high-cost city. Yes. So can we exchange space for cost or money resources? So again, food for thought. So whether constraints are real constraints or relative constraints, or constraints in terms of trade-off with other objectives. So taking this route, we can argue that when we manage a constraint city, and actually in that sense, any city could be a constraint city in terms, they only differ in terms of degree. So how do we face the question of trade-off? How do we face the question of politics? There's some issues, they are not totally undoable, but we do face political constraints. Transport. Now, there are many achievements in transport, and I try to highlight some of them so that we don't become too sort of disappointed with our city, especially given what happened in the last couple of years. Hong Kong's international airport is the #1 cargo airport in the world. Hong Kong is #3 international passenger airport in the world, after Dubai Airport and London Heathrow Airport. So these are things we are proud of. We are well connected to 220 destinations worldwide. Every day, I mean, some of us, we cannot just imagine about how busy Hong Kong airport is. Average over 1,100 flights per day. So we are talking a lot of flights even within an hour. Now, I'm talking about things before the pandemic, of course. But once the pandemic is over, I'm sure Hong Kong would return to that kind of busy airport. Our port used to be the #1 port in the world about 15 years ago. Now we are down to #5, #6. Now, the #5 in 2018, the latest situation, #6. And we have been pushed aside by emerging airports on the mainland for various reasons. Hong Kong's infrastructure, rated #1 in the world by the Global Competitiveness Study of the World Economic Forum for 7 consecutive years until 2017. And it was overtaken by Singapore in 2018. Public transport, ranked by McKinsey and Company as the #1 in the world in terms of efficiency, ahead of Singapore, Paris, Moscow, and Seoul. And in fact, we have the highest rate of the use of public transport. Over 90% daily commuter trips are taking public transport. And this is the highest rate in the world, higher than Shanghai, Singapore, London, New York. And that implies that our public transport system is highly accessible and generally affordable, and it could reach a wide range of destinations within the city. Now, of course, these achievements are all before 2019. 2019 has changed a lot of things. So the big question is, can transport resilience and global connectivity be restored and sustained after the pandemic is over, after the political trouble is sort of put aside? But a deeper question is, what do we mean by sustaining transport resilience? Should sort of growth in transport infrastructure, in our railway system, in our roads, be unlimited? Should we allow a continuous growth in cars? So when I was Secretary for Transport Housing, my big dilemma is, do we build more rail links, construct more roads, build more car parks in order to cater for more cars, in order to meet the demand for more trips? Or should we come to a point, where we reflect on the actual needs for growth? Should growth be unlimited, or should there be constraints? We should not build more roads. We should ask people to use greener forms of transport. But there's always a trade-off. There's always the trade-off between different needs and the different kinds of constraints we have to pay attention to. So this is about transport, and ultimately is about balancing. In mobility, public transport to be said as the most efficient. It carries more people. It particularly the rail network. It uses less road space compared to cars, for example. But there is constraint in the transport system. And affordability compared to other big cities, I think public transport fares are not unduly high, generally affordable. But for people living in more distant places, maybe they spend too much on transport. So there is the issue of how much, or whether, of course, we should subsidize transport. And in fact, the current government has already provided public transport subsidy to people. But how much subsidy is needed or is reasonable? Now that again is a question. And if you subsidize transport, would that induce more use of transport? So what is the trade-off? Connectivity. We rely a lot on transport infrastructure in order to reach the other parts of the region and world. And even within the city, there is demand for more rail links. When I was secretary, we launched a railway development strategy in 2014, advocating the building of several new railway lines and extension lines. And then it's a regret that we haven't started the first one. But the big question still is, after those proposals in the 2014 package, do we still build more rail links? There is a physical geographical constraint. And if you can't build more, what is the situation? What is the alternative? It's time that we start thinking. And livability in terms of the housing environment, the accessibility to mobility modes, green transport, whether we can reduce intra-district transport needs. In the past, and I'm talking about the 1970s and 1980s, there was a time when people in Hong Kong thought that perhaps we could have self-sustaining communities, so that people work and live in the same community, therefore they have less demand for transport. But it seems that that is not that practical in the real world, in the real situation. Green mobility. Now, this has been on the government's agenda for at least a couple of decades, if not longer. And in the last week, the government has published a roadmap on popularization of electric vehicles, promoting e-vehicles. And e-vehicles, of course, is much better than the conventional vehicles, but there's a difference between e-cars and e-buses, for example. Now, I'm all for turning our public transport system into the e-form, but whether we should encourage people to have more cars, even e-cars, I think that is a big dilemma, because e-cars also use road space. So do we have space for more roads? And what is the downside of that? We should certainly promote more cycling. But again, the physical environment in Hong Kong right now is not that conducive to the use of bicycles in the urban areas. We are promoting a bicycle or cycling friendly environment in the suburbs, in the new towns, new development areas, but not in the urban area, because the roads are already fully occupied by conventional mechanized transport. So what is the trade-off? Walkability, yes, we should enable people to walk more comfortably, more space for walking. When I was secretary, in my last year, I launched the Livability initiative, but it is a very funny mindset. When people are sort of in a more relaxed environment, they also support walkability. But when you want to do something about the design of roads, let's say you want to remove a bus stop from a certain spot, so as to make the road traffic smoother, and then because of doing that, passengers after getting off the bus might have to walk for an extra 5 minutes. Then you have an uproar. People would not support that kind of change. So sometimes you just wonder whether they are really genuine believers in walking. Now, finally, this is the final part of my presentation, Hong Kong as a smart city. Now, this is a slide sort of from the government's Smart City Blueprint 2017, covering smart mobility, smart living, smart environment, smart government, smart economy. Most of the time it's about how to make the best use of the latest IT, innovation technology, how to make the best use of data, digital technology. And there are several missions, and I would like to focus on the first one because it talks about making people happier, healthier, smarter, and more prosperous, and our city greener, cleaner, more livable, sustainable, resilient, and competitive. All the nice keywords about resilience, sustainability. So perhaps we should examine whether our future development in becoming a smarter city to really deliver those objectives. And I'm sure Chris Hartley after me will talk more about his research findings on that. Now, just a few highlights for thought and reflection. Innovation. This is regarded as Industrial Revolution 3.0, or some would say 4.0. Now, we don't bother about how to classify the current stage of industrial revolution. But innovation, there is a distinction between invention and innovation. Because innovation implies putting things into practice, application. It implies not just the generation of ideas, but also the putting ideas into practice. And nowadays, we are focusing on the digital era. The world is becoming digital, and we have the means to do it. Our iPhone can take us around the world. So everything in iPhone, banking, booking a restaurant, checking information, retrieving books or papers. So it becomes so easy. But then I sort of would like to remind ourselves what Marshall McLuhan has said, the medium artificial intelligence, big data, but big data could also mean big brother. So again, a debatable issue. Social media, all the good things about social media in terms of transmitting information, but social media has also been criticized as a source of sometimes fake news, distorted information, overexcited sentiments, and now we are talking about social media politics as well. Sharing economy. There was a time that when people are so excited about sharing the sharing economy, but now perhaps there are all more thought, more reservations about certain aspects of a sharing economy, because even if you have a sharing economy, you still have predatory capitalism. So we are into a new form, a new level of predatory capitalism. Smart city. The big question is not just the smart city itself, but for whom? For what? Who can gain more from a smart city? So once you come to the political side of it, there are more questions. Now, I think I would skip this slide, but because of time. But I would like to recommend the audience to read this paper published in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy in 2017. Innovation policy, what, why, and how. I think this is a very useful article. And some of the key issues are, they are not just about innovation itself as a means, as a technology, but more about the implications of technology, of innovation, the implications for the life we live, the implications for the society and the world around us, and implications for future development. Because innovation is not sort of neutral, because it does affect how society is to be organized and run in future. The final slide, the challenges of innovation. And I would like to highlight a few real challenges. Can policy catch up with advancement in technology and innovation? My experience in government so far is it cannot until now. Technology has always grown much faster than policy. It's regulatory regime behind actual market practices driven by new technology. Again, our regulatory regime is behind. And maybe the kind of regulatory regime that we have in place is not fit for the purpose of the latest innovation technology. For example, the kind of sharing economy we are talking about, Uber, Airbnb, and in future, autonomous vehicles, AVs, and so on and so forth. How do we reconcile regulation and innovation? Innovation perhaps demands less restriction, more imagination, but regulation tends to restrict space and imagination, some would say. And the question of IT, government driven by IT. Even now, in the midst of the pandemic, whether we should use the government's Leave Home Safely application. There's a lot of debate whether we are exposing privacy data and so on and so forth. So the question of the digital big brother. And of course, if the government has more social trust, maybe it's easier to roll out more IT-driven means in managing society. Because ultimately information is power. Who knows what, how, and why? So it's not merely technological solution, because solution can also create problem. So I will stop here. I perhaps overuse a bit of my time, but I'm sure the other two speakers will take up some of the issues raised, and they have their particular perspectives, which would enable us to understand the Constraint City in a broader manner. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Anthony, for helping us set the stage of discussing Hong Kong as a constrained city. Our next speaker is Chris Hartley, who's assistant professor here at the Department of Asian and Policy Studies at Education University of Hong Kong. He's going to share with us his findings from a study that he recently completed on trust and legitimacy in a smart city. Over to you, Chris.
Okay, thank you very much, Donald. It's a real pleasure to be invited here, and I thank everybody who organized this. Anthony, it's always a pleasure to see you too, and you raised some very compelling and interesting points. And I'd like to welcome Professor Christina. Look forward to your presentation as well. Will the slides be shared, or shall I share them myself? Okay, so I'll share screen then myself. and we'll go over to the slides that I have prepared for today. Please let me know if anything is unclear or you can't hear me or you can't see anything. So today I'll be talking about this slide, or rather this study that I conducted in late 2019 to gather data about public perceptions of smart cities in Hong Kong. And I believe this fits very well into what Professor Chung has been saying this morning, because it
Chris,
really...
Chris, do you want to share your slides? I mean, project your slides.
Yes, I'm getting a lot of feedback. Yes, the slides are being shared. Can you not see them? Can you see the slides?
I mean, can you project?
Project the slides? Oh, I see what you're saying. You want the projection. Got it. Sorry about that. Okay. Yes, thank you. I was getting a little feedback from the audio, so apologies for that. So this is the one of the articles that are going to be coming out of this study that I did last year. There's another one, two others that are under revise and resubmit. And it's an interesting study because it gets to what Professor Chung was speaking about in terms of constraints. So the smart cities literature and a lot of what we understand about smart cities has focused so much on not only the technical or mechanical aspects of smart cities, but also on the kind of managerial aspects of them as well. And yet politics seems to have been something that has not been examined with such robust enthusiasm. And this is not only true of Hong Kong smart cities, but around the world. So there's an emerging literature that seeks to measure and understand the political legitimacy of smart city projects. And this is one effort in that direction. I come from a particular theoretical perspective that one might consider sort of critical. I take a critical approach of the development of knowledge, and that doesn't mean critical in the very common sense. I don't necessarily criticize policies a lot, but the more sort of critical theoretical perspective says that what is underlying our understandings about policies, our understandings about state-society relations, are very particular types of power dynamics that certain power interests and elite power interests have the privilege of defining what we care about. In other words, naming and framing policy problems. And the type of theoretical work that I'm coming from and the perspective that I'm coming from says that the way policy making observes problems, and Professor Chung mentioned many of these types of problems, principal among which, of course, is housing, but a lot of other problems as well, is that we take a look at the things that we can measure easily. And the old business adage, you can't manage what you can't measure, means that the things that we can measure get most of the attention. And that the way we view policy problems ring fences our vision of what they really mean, and thus aligns them quite well with the types of technological answers that we have. And that brings us into smart city discussion. But even as far back as the mid-50s and prior, we've seen that there's an acknowledgement that types of policy problems we look at in cities, particularly in cities and in a place like Hong Kong that has a convergence of problems, are not reducible to just a handful of metrics, that there are a lot of complex issues that we need to look at that we can't always so easily understand. And this has given birth to the literature on wicked problems and other types of problems which came into focus in the 1970s. But my argument is that the smart cities idiom, the smart cities approach, focuses in more deeply on the things we can measure, and yet things that are sort of softer in nature or more qualitative in nature sometimes risk being ignored. So just as a matter of background to my discussion on smart cities, we could see evidence of a type of smartness showing up in cities throughout the 20th century and even before. We could argue that rationality is sort of instrumental rationality, that is the application of very specific policy solutions to very well-defined problems, has existed long before the smart cities era, because it's a mindset, it's an underlying mindset that simply says measure, apply, and solve. We see this in the built environment. This is an example of Paris here, a project that was never done, but an effort to sort of scrub up or rationalize the mess that was Paris. We see this in the Dongdaemun Design Complex in Seoul here. We see it even in Ordos in China, and continuing plans in Singapore. The idea that we can apply very rational types of physical planning solutions that might also have the benefit of helping us address other types of problems in society. And thus, this is kind of old epistemic that the modern smart cities approach helps us to solve. And I always enjoy showing this this comic, which you may or may not find funny, but it's the idea that just because we have data on everything doesn't necessarily mean that we can produce the type of answers we need to proceed with good policy. And yet there's copious evidence that this type of thinking, this sort of rationalization that leads us to the smart cities era, has not always been able to achieve all that it was promised to do, including alleviating social problems such as poverty, socioeconomic inequality, etc. And of course, this is one classic example of this Pruitt-Igoe housing complex in St. Louis in the United States, which was seen to be part of a rationalizing project, the Great Society, etc., that actually did not achieve the social ends that it intended, perhaps due in part to a big misunderstanding about the political dimensions of what was going on, the political dimensions underlying poverty. Simply putting people in tower block housing and providing funding for education wasn't necessarily going to solve decades or centuries of racial and economic oppression that America had been dealing with for so long and arguably continues to deal with today. So there is pushback on this type of thinking. Robert Moses is a classic case of rationalist instrumental thinking in urban planning, the type of urban planning that we see throughout Asia and the rest of the world as well, even continuing to dominate. And then the pushback by Jane Jacobs, sort of an example of what community activism, what grassroots mobilizing, what the voice of the people can do to try to create a city that is more livable in the way they define it, rather than necessarily livable in the terms of faster highways, wider roads, taller buildings, etc., that we so associate with kind of a modernist view of the city. So that is very brief background. I could have done in a lot longer period of time, but in the interest of time, I'll try to speed it up. This leads to the notion of smart cities. The literature that I could walk you through, as I said before, has focused so much on smart cities as practical application, but what about the softer aspects of it? And I developed this little sort of four-dimensional thing that allows us to focus what we're talking about in terms of these softer aspects. The governance aspects, including awareness and communication, understanding the needs and the demand from the people who are using these smart cities. There was an interesting SCMP commentary in the last couple of weeks about how smart city projects in Hong Kong, including the Stay Home Safe app, et cetera, are not necessarily aligned with what people understand as some things that they need. And this raises issues of trust and legitimacy as well, and then the ideals and aspirations of society. So I decided to create a survey which was generously funded through the Department of Asian and Policy Studies, our telephone poll survey grant, in which I was attempted to set up a sort of a very simple regression model examining through data what the relationships might be between questions about trust and notions of what smart cities mean and the support of smart cities in general. So I'll share the results of these momentarily. I actually used a sort of a Likert scale, and I asked respondents, about 1,000 respondents across Hong Kong, to give on the Likert scale from highly disagree to highly agree, whether they agree with these following statements. I trust technologies. The Hong Kong government keeps my personal information safe, which is of course a big issue in smart cities. I'm willing to sacrifice data privacy for the benefit of society. Hong Kong, here's my concerns. And of course, I wish I have more opportunity to provide input into smart cities programs. So just a very high-level overview of respondent characteristics, which I won't go into in detail, but of course, they're always necessary to share when we talk about any type of sample set. It did skew. The only things to note here is it skewed just a little bit older in this case, because about half of the surveys were done by landline and then half were done by mobile telephone. Also skewed a little bit on the occupation and a little bit on monthly income as well, which could have something to do with the fact that we ended up talking to many more retired people than sort of the other sort of subgroups. So just a very high level results here, sort of univariate analysis Many are sort of neutral on the awareness of Hong Kong's attempt to improve smart cities, but are quite sanguine on the ability of smart cities to improve quality of life. So we see at least agree and very agree, far outperforming very, disagree and disagree. Plans are intended to provide public benefits for all residents. So this is the sort of the distributional question. And it appeared as though respondents were a little more skeptical about that aspect. Respondents said that Hong Kong should aspire to be a smart city and embrace technology, but of course they did not necessarily back up their support with a willingness to personally sacrifice financially, in other words, through payment of taxes. And then trust and privacy concerns. These were the statements that I shared with you earlier, and not many, sort of not much very high agreement on that. That we still see sort of an underlying skepticism. We could go into more detail about this, but generally the narrative to draw out of this is that that trust in smart cities is still very halting, and that even in the literature and as it bears out in surveys, trust in data security and privacy particularly are concerns as well. At the same time, I wanted to draw the survey into what do people understand as the benefit of smart cities. So as Professor Chung said, people have to be able to recognize how policies improve their lives. And so this is one of the early or only efforts, at least based in Hong Kong, to see whether people understand how smart cities can, governance factors improve by smart cities and how smart cities can improve. Clearly, public services are received, very agree and agree, receives sort of the highest optimism. And that is probably fairly understandable given that many smart cities issues are applied to very practical operational things like transport or like bookings for services, et cetera. Lower degrees of fairness as we see the smart cities narrative beginning to tilt towards how can we create a more equitable, just and sustainable society. Still seems to be a fair amount of skepticism on their ability to do that. Public participation as well, and then sort of transparency, we don't see as much optimism as we do in just standard public services. So then finally, I decided to look at issues related to the practical application of smart cities. And I drew my questions, or at least the topics of my questions, from the SCSI Smart Cities Assessment criteria. Most of the smart city surveys have been done by private organizations or even firms and companies. So this is marks one of the important efforts at that. So taking these factors here, buildings, energy, environment, mobility, education, et cetera, and health, I sought to see whether citizens believe that their quality of life could be improved through smart cities on each of these dimensions. And we see mobility and transportation predictably showing up under agree, very, very agree, because probably people are able to see how those technologies apply to better, more efficient transportation, things like not just sort of bus sequencing, but also open data about when buses arrive, et cetera. And to some degree on health and education, a little bit less on buildings and energy and environment. So finally, and I won't go into huge detail about this because it's a bit wonkish, but these are the results of the regression. What I attempted to do was to associate the concepts about info security, willingness to sacrifice privacy, with whether that associated with the statement that Hong Kong should aspire to be a smart city. So clearly we found that those who had positive impressions about these things were much more willing to believe that Hong Kong should aspire to be a smart city. And this is to be expected. So these were sort of supporting the hypotheses. So we're not disproving these hypotheses. But in this case, it was interesting. I'll draw your attention to the negative sign on education. So higher levels of education led to a declining support for smart cities. This was a control variable, but I noticed that sometimes the behavior of the control variable can be an interesting point of research unto itself. And I think that brings up some interesting issues in Hong Kong, particularly with regard to the political situation in the past couple of years, the movement by some students in universities to bring awareness to some political problems, et cetera, and the challenges that they face. And that with more education, it's noted that there seemed to be some more skepticism. So I call this an informed skepticism. The more you know, the more skeptical you are. This final regression output here is just taking that notion of support for smart cities and adding the fiscal support aspect to it. So do you support paying taxes for smart cities? So all the hypotheses bear out on that one as well. Education taking a negative sign, but significant in only one, so that was a bit of a change. And then we see income becoming significant as well. So in a way that states that with higher levels of income, people were actually less willing to pay taxes to support smart cities, which is really quite interesting actually, because one would think that it would be the other way around. So these issues are sort of raising some interesting points of future research, but the last couple slides here, sort of implications of this. You know, we should look at smart cities not only as sort of, as I said, the bits in the circuits or the cool applications, et cetera, but we really should dig behind the notion of smart cities to see what is the underlying philosophy, that the governance philosophy that resides there. And I argue that it's a long-standing governance philosophy of optimization, managerialization, and what I call instrumental rationality. That is, we can measure the things that are the problem, we can apply the solutions. And yet when we see social and cultural and political circumstances destabilized, which we saw not only here in Hong Kong in the past couple of years, but we're seeing all over the world, including in the United States, that often leads to, at least the brand of it we're seeing now, it leads to a declining trust in public institutions, declining trust in government. And the question is, does that declining trust, might that also spill over into declining trust in smart technologies as well? We might remember during the protest era that some students or some protesters had knocked down a smart street lamp, for example. I could have put a picture of that up here, but I didn't. Does that represent a type of pushback against technology, because technology is equated with you know, this sort of some type of political agenda that is being held at the governance level? So we need to understand these issues. And then this is the final slide here, looking down the road. Can we use the NSL as kind of a pre and post treatment to see how attitudes about government and even smart cities have changed? Did attitudes about government change, but attitudes about smart city remain the same? Or are government and smart cities so coterminous, so interlinked with each other, that any skepticism of government's also going to spill over into skepticism about technology as well? I think if I can get funding, it would be interesting to do this a more longitudinal and see how that unfolds, as Hong Kong has another, 26, 27 years of this one country, two systems before it officially integrates with China in 2047. And I also want to expand this to ASEAN countries and other contexts as well. And finally, I believe that this does line up with some work that Daryl Jarvis and I did on political legitimacy in COVID-19 response. And that is another, just a slight plug here, right as I finish. Colleagues and I at University of Melbourne have just finished a survey in Hong Kong of about 2,500 people looking at trust and legitimacy of COVID-19 response policies here in Hong Kong. And we're going to be comparing those with the same in Australia, and we're writing that paper up now. So that's a space to watch there, and I'll be excited to share that when the time comes. So thank you very much. I've really tried to keep it tight and close. I hope I didn't unduly gloss over certain things, but I'd be happy to go into more detail about that if people have questions down the road. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and Christine, I look forward to your presentation now.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Chris. That was quite a, quite a wide overview of, and you raised a lot of interesting issues. Not just your research findings, but especially the reminder that technology and these smart city applications are not just a neutral expression of technocratic solutions. Often we have to understand the broader context. The same technological solution may evoke very different responses in different societies. Look at this pandemic where various societies have rolled out contact tracing and in the case of Hong Kong, leave home safe kind of solutions. But the way societies respond to them, to a large extent, reflect underlying levels of trust in government, underlying levels of political legitimacy. Thanks also for reminding us that there's a long history of instrumental rationality, where urban planners, holding these grand utopian visions of the city, might overly technocratize, right? Might overly apply technological solutions to what are inherently more social, human, complex problems that are not amenable to straight linear solutions. And so that Jane Jacobs versus Le Corbusier sort of dichotomies is a very useful, interesting reminder for us. And in many ways, I agree with your starting premise that smart cities, to a large extent, reflect or could reflect a reincarnation of that Le Corbusier visions of creating these utopian, rational cities. Which leads us very nicely to Professor Christine Lowe's presentation, because as I understand it, she's going to speak about, this is really a complex, wicked sort of problem, and Hong Kong in many ways is at the leading edge, at the forefront of grappling with cities and environmental constraints as a complex issue. So just a brief introduction. Professor Christine Lowe was previously the Undersecretary of the Environment. She's currently the Chief Development Strategist at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Over to you, Christine.
Hi, good morning in Hong Kong. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to talk to you. Now, I just want to say that I really enjoyed the two presentations. Planning and policies are complex, and they're complex everywhere, not just in Hong Kong. And they're complex because we're talking about multiple numbers of people with different attitudes and different experience. And of course, in every jurisdiction where these decisions have to be taken, there's a cultural and historical dimension as well. And I also want to say that, Anthony, I think you mentioned that how people make decisions, what are the problems Hong Kong has, and right at the end of your discussion, you shared your concern with us that it's very difficult to keep up with technology. But let me say that dealing with technology, demographic change, and political change is very challenging. And in Hong Kong, on top of the kind of problems that other jurisdictions have as well, we have one of political change. A change of sovereignty is a very big deal. And what I want to talk about today is perhaps the predicament that Hong Kong finds itself in, transiting from the system that we had under British colonial rule to where we are today. And of course, we have a new sovereign where the systems and the thinking and the background are just so different. And of course, in a highly globalized world, we're all watching each other. We're all interested in best practices, but actually different jurisdictions, the decisions they make are made within different contexts. So whilst we see good ideas or bad ideas and things that work and things that don't work in other places, whether they can work and how they can work in our own jurisdiction really is a separate discussion. So I'm describing Hong Kong at the moment is, are we in a difficult situation of neither being fish nor fowl under a situation of changing political sovereignty? So here's a quick summary of what I want to address, right? I already talked about Hong Kong. Hong Kong needs, I think, a new narrative in order to face the problems that we have. And this new narrative needs to be internal for our own people in Hong Kong, as well as external, whether that's nationally, that's within China, as well as internationally. Now, today, we actually have a new narrative if we wanted to adopt it, and this is the net zero, the climate change, carbon neutrality narrative. Is that one where we can absorb and use it for change that we all need to face coming? And I also want to address the issue of a governance mindset. And this really is part of the governing culture of any place. So one of the things we might want to explore is what kind of administrative and governance mindset do we have? And how do we stimulate that mindset to be more open and innovative? Some of the things that Anthony talked about towards the end of his talk. I believe that the conditions in Hong Kong are really not bad. And there are positive conditions available for Hong Kong to reinvigorate the governance and the private sector leadership that we have. Now, so very, very briefly, Hong Kong has already given itself a date with destiny. And that is not just Hong Kong, in fact. The EU, the national government, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Canada, the UK, and perhaps the US have signed on to net zero. So this is a directional change for the world. So the question is, since Hong Kong has also committed to net zero 2050, we have a date with destiny. Now, last year, one of the biggest news in the world was China declaring that it will pledge to become net zero by 2060 and peak carbon by 2030. This is now a driving force for change in China. In Hong Kong, in our last policy address, the Hong Kong government has said that Hong Kong will strive to achieve carbon neutrality before 2050. But if you read the entire text of the chief executive's policy address, you find many ideas, many commitments and plans, but they seem disjointed, because if net zero is actually your driver for change, and the world is using this as a driver for change, then I think arguably what government needs to do is to look at all of its policies and see how it should fit in to net zero. And it doesn't seem like the government has done this yet, although it's inching towards a situation where various bureaus and departments are now looking at how to achieve carbon neutrality. This is something you've all seen before. When we are talking about net zero, we are talking about a revolution. And as I said, we're not just talking about Hong Kong. Hong Kong is in fact relatively small. So when the whole country, 1.4 billion people in China, when Japan and Korea and other parts of the world are on this march, how is Hong Kong really going to fit in? So if you look at government narrative, they talked about, electricity, we're going to decarbonize, we're going to have retrofitting buildings to make them more energy efficient. And today we've already also talked about transportation and how good Hong Kong is, because a high level of our trips are already done by public transport. And then, of course, we need to do much better on waste management. I mean, those are clear enough, but actually to do any of those things, and to do any of those things in a smart way, in terms of implementing them in the city, it involves land use planning, transport, infrastructure, R&D, technology, administration, finance. It really is about systems change in all of those areas, in both the public and the private sector. So the question really is, how do we put all of these complexities together for change? Now, the global narrative is really about net zero and then the dates of 2050. And it is pushing uphill. We talked about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, and I'm not going to go into the details because my assumption is, I think you know what I'm talking about. The point that I only want to make here is there's a global narrative. I mean, the point I'm trying to make is net zero is a global march to the future. And for Hong Kong, we need to be very cognizant of that and be part of that global narrative. Now, I want to give an example of a net zero narrative. This is the EU's narrative. If you can just have a look at the little pictures, right? They start off by saying the EU and the economy, right, of EU will become climate neutral by 2050. Then it talks about protection of human life, animals and plants, and cutting pollution. It talks about helping companies to get there. And then, of course, it has to be a just and inclusive future. Here's another diagram where you see more of everything needing to fit in. The reason I put this here is just to echo some of what Anthony has said at the end. Actually, when governments today, when they talk about the future of their cities, you are going to see an assemblage of this kind of thing being repeated by many, many authorities around the world. Now, your relative emphasis on which ones is, of course, dependent on specific communities. But all of these issues are going to be important. And at the back of which you are trying to decarbonize, you're trying to transform your economy to become a sustainable, green, and low carbon economy. This is a huge revolution for the entire world. Some people also use the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a way of explaining the kind of policies that government wants to do. And the UN has laid out 17 goals. And again, if you can imagine that these blocks are like Lego games, depending again on your specific need in your jurisdiction, how you want to stick these things together. So the reason I'm coming here is just to say this is part of the global narrative. And the private sector has also now absorbed some of these narratives to use it for pointing the future direction of their companies and their industries. China itself also has developed mission and narrative. And this is maybe a very simplistic way of showing China's narrative, which is often in 5-year plans or in packages of 5-year plans. And recently, the narratives is about a beautiful China, and a beautiful China is a clean, pollution-free, low-carbon China. And China has also come up with a pillar for development, not environmental policies, but a pillar for development, which is green development, which they call ecological civilization. So between now, the 14th 5-year plan, and 2060, the transition is through carbon neutrality when we're talking about industrial and technological change. So the question that I have that Hong Kong needs to explore is, how will Hong Kong and how will the government of Hong Kong position us nationally and globally when the world talks about net zero? The positioning, you could say, is a communication strategy, but also in Hong Kong itself, we do have to meet our own challenge to become net zero by 2050. And what we do in Hong Kong also requires a revolution. It's very clear that the national and local sentiments is, because Hong Kong is an international financial center, green finance is very important here, which means that Hong Kong will be the international and regional fundraising center to help China and the Asia Pacific to raise the trillions and trillions of dollars that we're going to need to meet net zero. Now, the point I'm really coming to is this fish or fowl issue. I want to give an illustration of what it takes Hong Kong to do. Now, we talked about public transport, and you see a number of pictures here, you know, our typical public transport services. Let's take taxi as an example. We have 18,000 taxis or thereabout. They are run by LPG. We know that taxi licenses are very expensive. Our taxi service, you could say, as you can get a taxi, they are very cheap by world standards, and you can get everywhere by taxis. However, the vehicle itself is very basic. Many people complain about the service itself, the driving, the quality of the vehicle, and so on. So this financial operating model that Hong Kong has, which is also drive your car to death, right? It's a very simple, the vehicles are very simple, and they're cheap to maintain, and the vehicle is on the road 24 hours a day. So when we think about, well, why don't we electrify, you know, EVs, because they are already available to run taxis. But Hong Kong is not able to do that And it's actually beyond even just the infrastructure. Even if we had charging stations or batteries for cars, it's very difficult to think of an operation model to depart from the one that we have today. So the thinking is, if we wanted to change the vehicles, we have to essentially change the operating model of taxis in Hong Kong. Or if you look at those two buses, well, we now have, we actually, two of our bus companies have now been sold to a new owner. How is policy going to work with the new owner so that their buses are rationalized to be more efficient? That sort of thing takes a long time in Hong Kong. And what is the future technology for double-decker buses? Is it hydrogen? Is it batteries? What kind of conversation are going on between government, the bus operators, and financiers? So how are they going to go forward to think about the transformation to net zero for public transport in Hong Kong? Now, again, if you're looking at minibuses, we already have electric vehicles for that size of vehicle. But again, fitting into the Hong Kong operating model is what is necessary, is not the technology itself. So when we look at the government's popularization plan for electric vehicles that Anthony talked about, one thing that it doesn't talk about is changing the operating model. Essentially, it talks about private vehicles. It doesn't talk about these public vehicles because they're kind of in the too difficult bracket, because you're talking about having to change the operating financing models of these services. So the fish or fowl problem, I'm coming to the end. So I think it's important for Hong Kong to have clear policies to change incentives and behaviors, including systems changes. This is where we need public-private sector truly engaged discussions about change. None of this is easy. And who should lead this? I mean, obviously the government should lead this because it is government policy to go net zero. Secondly is, I do believe that integrating policy making wherever you are is very, very important. And the question that we've always had in Hong Kong is, how good are we to have all the bureaus and the departments and the regulatory bodies in Hong Kong today really working together and thinking together? I think Hong Kong can massively improve in this regard. Now, how to do that, that's a separate discussion. And because net zero is a revolution for the entire economy, you are going to need all hands on deck. That means the private sector, the financial sector, the government sector, and of course, the public. So engagement, truly engagement, to explore and define new solutions that are technically sound, that are operable on the ground, and that are affordable. I mean, these are very complex and challenging discussions. And I think the economies that do well is precisely because they are able to do that. Now, so in the US, what you have is an attitude where they're willing to try things. So for example, if we're looking at the regulatory situations here of the Facebooks and the Googles of the world, they've let these companies develop, and it is only now that they're talking about and how do we regulate them. Now, I'm not saying that's the right way to go. What I'm saying is, for the Americans, the underpinning culture of their administration is, okay, it's new, we don't have any regulation for them, we let them run. They're quite encouraging of people trying and failing and succeeding. In Hong Kong, we tend to be more paternalistic, but that paternalism in terms of whether it sufficiently encourages innovation or not, that's really one of the arguments that we've discussed for a long time in Hong Kong. Now, during my time as undersecretary in the government, we came up with something called the 4 Ts. We want people, and this should include government, that you should have a timeline, you should have a target, you should have transparency, which means You need to be able to show people that you are making headways or you're not. So this is really, transparency has to do with accountability. And lastly, because government can't solve problems all by themselves, nor do they have the knowledge to solve all problems, it's really important to bring everybody together. But you need to understand how to do that. And I think Hong Kong can improve greatly on that. So my last 2 points is, we need to stake out a role. If Hong Kong is going to be known as a leader in anything in the net zero world, we need to stake out a role nationally, and we need to stake out a role internationally. And to be able to do that, we need excellent communication. We need to be very clear about our vision, how we are going to get there. It doesn't mean you've solved all the problems, but you've got to be able to tell people in a compelling way what you're doing, why you're doing it that way, and how you're going to sustain your enthusiasm for the net zero transition for the next 30 to 40 years. Thank you very much.
A carbon neutrality target. So let me welcome the participants. To feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll read them out to our speakers. So maybe I can start by saying, about asking Anthony as well as the other panelists. About 10 years ago, the talk was about urbanization and how do we urbanize in a sustainable way. And I remember, I think it's just over 10 years ago, the world had crossed a threshold in which more than 50% of the world's population then lived in cities. And of course, a large part of that was driven by China's incredible urbanization rates throughout the 2000s. And if you view it from that perspective, actually Hong Kong is starting from a strong base, right? In the sense that Hong Kong's, you had a slide, Anthony, about how the problem of affordability is not about cost, it's about whether you are an urban sprawl. And Hong Kong avoided that. And you've got very dense, compact districts. We've got very high usage of public transport. And the contrast with mainland cities that were developing in the 90s, 2000s was very, very, very stark. Because in many of these mainland cities, the model was indeed one of urban sprawl, which made investments in connectivity, in public transport, less viable. Fast forward 10, 15 years to where we are today. And as you said, Anthony, we seem to have lost, Hong Kong seems to have lost that edge in terms of urban sustainability and being a pioneer, innovative city in terms of sustainability. Could you say something, Anthony, about the very issues that Christine raised about, what sort of bureaucratic responses or governmental mechanisms, institutional mechanisms are required for that sort of change that Christine highlighted?
I think I like the analogy used by Christine, the neither fish nor fowl analogy, description. Of course, Christine located that neither fish nor fowl in terms of Hong Kong's transition from the period under the British colonial administration and the period now as an SAR of China. But I would use that logic to actually examine Hong Kong's process of urban growth, maybe starting from the 1950s, as neither fish nor fowl. In other words, it's not entirely government taking the lead in every aspects, because Hong Kong had at that time was very sort of proud of its non-interventionist governing philosophy. But in actual practice, the government was not idle. The government was not entirely laissez-faire. And strategic aspects, or in terms of emergencies or pressing social needs, the government did intervene in various ways. And we can see that sometimes there was no model to start with. The model only began to be more visible post hoc. Now, take the example of the development of public housing. We like to say that public housing in Hong Kong first started because, almost by accident, of a fire in Jacket May squatters during Christmas time in 1953 or 4. And then it started as a program to build rather rudimentary resettlement blocks, not an entirely sort of nice place to live in, but better than squatters. And then in the 1970s, the government then built on that initial program to start the current phase of public housing development. More plan, more driving force from government. So the public housing model in Hong Kong actually evolved in different phases and with different degrees of government involvement or the government's steering role. The building of public housing estates facilitated the building of new towns because of the presence of new population. Therefore, private land became more precious, more valuable. Private developers are more interesting. And then you have population, therefore you have infrastructure, transport links, and so on and so forth. And then you have the new towns actually having the capacity to grow. And that started not as an entirely planned process as in many mainland cities, but the kind of evolution in Hong Kong, I would say, is amid chaos and plan. So it's neither fish nor fowl in that sense. And I think that is rather typical of many things in Hong Kong. Government's regulation of the stock market. Again, initially it was entirely a private thing. The stock exchanges now, of course, the stock exchange is government owned. So I think that kind of neither fish nor fowl is still quite typical of Hong Kong today. Because now it has its upside and downside. But I think at this juncture, perhaps it's time to reflect whether we could continue with that kind of neither fish nor fowl approach, because as alluding to what Christina said, if net zero is indeed a world goal, and in theory, it should permeate into all sectors and all policy domains. Now, whether or not we have sufficient willpower to push it forward, and that demand a lot of leadership, not just government leadership, but government in alignment with business, finance, industries, and so forth. And therefore, Hong Kong perhaps has come to a stage where it could not stay in the past neither fish nor fowl more approach. So we have more to be more top down or steering role by government.
Christine, you want to chip in here about Anthony's kind of somewhat different take on the fish and fowl metaphor, which I agree is very powerful.
No, I do agree with Anthony. The fish and fowl metaphor can cover many different perspectives. I mean, the one that I was focusing on is, we've come from a colonial administration background. And by the time the British left Hong Kong, you could say that that colonial system of administration was a kind of late colonial form. And Hong Kong is small, and we're now an adjunct of a very big country that is changing very fast. And that that form on the mainland is a very strong state-led system. And I think people on the mainland sometimes don't understand Hong Kong because we're so unlike them. And for us in Hong Kong, well, we think we're never going to be that state-led. But as Anthony explained, it's not like policymakers here are not have never intervened. In fact, at different times in our history, including in the stock market and the currency market, we have intervened very, very greatly. So, but as we go towards the new things that we are now trying to think through, under a new situation with a new political sovereignty, with the world, if indeed, the world goal is net zero, what does it take? And I think part of the argument outside Hong Kong, the world global narrative coming from the EU and China is government policy is so important, because what policy, and only policy can do this, is internalize externalities, right? Which is to make people and businesses want to choose more low carbon and green choices. So laws, policies, demands of green finance, reporting and disclosure of environmental footprint for companies. I mean, why are we seeing all of this? We're seeing all of this as a result of the pursuit of green and low carbon. So if that's going to continue, then you do need your regulators and also your government policymakers sitting in the administration to be much more robust in these areas.
Yeah, I think that's both of you agree that there's a lot more scope and a lot more demand for more active government. May not be bigger government, but certainly more active, more vigorous, more a government that is able to has a greater capacity to lead this significant transformations that carbon neutrality would demand. So on that issue of government activism, there are a couple of questions about willingness to pay taxes. So it's for you, Chris. Why are more highly educated people and higher income people less willing to pay taxes for these smart city? And I could broaden it out, not just smart city, but for sustainability more generally, right? Is it a reflection of a lack of trust among more educated, higher income people, or is it something else?
Right. No, it's an excellent question, and I think Fox and the other questioner who brought this up, Ming as well, a very interesting issue. So if you look here, the idea is that this is the second model. So this is talking about taxes. So we'll go to that question first, which was the question from Professor Fox. So we see, of course, education drop out and its significance, but income here, notably, it takes, I guess, even though I didn't look at these as primary interest variables, but they were control variables, but I guess you could say the sign on these results is a bit interesting and indicates this kind of reverse, but it's only significant across these four models. The one where it's not is in trust. So yes, that certainly does suggest in this model, as in the previous model with education, where education significance drops out in the trust model, that there is some kind of effect that trust is having on the outcome variable, which is support for smart cities, that's being picked up by trust that correlates to some degree with education and income. But more overall, I think for sure the notion that with rising levels of income, that people may be less willing to support smart city technologies in some of these other models is really quite confounding. And I think that we look at, we could look at sort of the political economy perspective or the political perspective and say, well, it does come down to notions about the role of government and the scope of government intervention and what is appropriate. And if we were to look at differing attitudes across levels of income on that, you might hypothesize that the people at low levels of income, the quality of their life is affected more directly by what the government chooses to do and not to do, whereas the quality of life of a person with a high income is maybe not necessarily as affected by government policies on, for example, healthcare, safety, the provision of transportation, the provision of other public services, of course, because people with higher incomes can kind of take care and provide those things for themselves. So their notion about the value and the role of government intervention in the life of the citizen is fundamentally different than what may be held by somebody who is largely dependent on government services, particularly low income. So I think the answer to this kind of, and to combine those two questions that we saw in the chat feature, is one, these were control variables. So because they were control variables, I didn't analyze their behavior specifically across different subgroups of the sample. But of course, that points to future research as well, for sure. And I think also that in any model that in which we would try to explain support for smart cities based on income and education, we would want to look at a lot of other factors related to political values and political ideologies. I did do that. I had a control variable for government quality of life. In other words, the government the government is responsible for improving the quality of life of citizens. We could see that as an ideological variable that does pick up significance in all of these models in this case. But then I think there are other measures of control variables related to political ideology that I could introduce into one of those. So the general question, I think, just to answer that is, if I'm hypothesizing off the top of my head what the relationship about income and support for smart cities would be, there would be an intervening variable related to political orientation or political values, and it would have something to do with how each group, lower income or higher income, feel that the government is either responsible for government services or is delivering them effectively. And I think that's less of an issue for higher income people than it would be for lower income people.
Thanks, Chris. Christine, there's a question for you on the
business model.
What happened? There was a question about how difficult was it really to change the public transport operating model, considering that bus franchises are only for 10 years. And you know, in the mainland, for instance, many of the major mainland cities have almost entirely turned their public bus fleet into electric ones. So how difficult is that an imagined constraint or a real constraint?
Well, I think we need to look at public transport perhaps totally. And obviously, there are some areas where we can start now, and we haven't done it in taxis and in minibuses. Now, double-decker buses, the reason, which I think the questioner, Alok Jain, understands very well, is that you can't just go out and freely buy a double-decker bus that is either driven by hydrogen or, you know, by electricity. But even if it was a new fuel bus like hydrogen, how Hong Kong is going to deal with that? If we don't have a forward-looking view on the technology, thinking about planning, you know, integrating all of these things together in terms of also working with the franchise companies, you know, what kind of competition model do we want? Or do we want to have a new kind of deal with the bus companies? Do you want to own the assets of the buses and let them operate? And what kind of transition do we need to go through? You know, bus companies are not very profitable in Hong Kong. We are very reticent to put up fares for public transport because people are deeply fearful of public complaint and dissatisfaction with government. So, I mean, I kind of I'm a bit concerned that in public transport, we have a golden goose, right? You know, we have had great services at low cost, but going forward, how are we going to sustain this? And who is thinking about it? So I very much like to see a new approach to this. And, you know, you've got to start off by having the government working very closely with the current operators and talking about what's the future model.
Well, Anthony, you would have followed.
Yes, I have some points to add. I think certainly the two questions raised in terms of public transport are very pertinent to how we look at the way forward. Now, in my presentation, I said I'm all for e-public transport. And I agree that it's time that we set some targets. Now, the delicate thing about public transport is that while government is the regulator, government is not the provider. We rely on private operators. We give them franchise, although they are for 10 years, but most, for example, public bus companies, they have been around for several franchises, and franchise is only taken back in rather extreme situations. So that should not be a major hurdle. But the major hurdle or major consideration is whether government can actually say, okay, by certain time, all, assuming the technology is there, the bus types are available, whether government can actually say, okay, by this date, all public buses must be e-vehicles. Now that involves, of course, whether there's a program for replacement of vehicles, whether there's a government role. I think during Christine's and my time in government, there was this program to encourage public light buses to switch to vehicles with lower emissions, and there was government financial support for that. I think government has to come to that decision as to whether it's willing to use money. Now, I hope the government would be more willing to use money, because sometimes in the past it's quite difficult to get funding for new initiatives. And if government has a will, assuming the technology is there, I think conceptually it's doable. But there is this point made by one of the someone in the audience that in Shenzhen you have available double-decker e-vehicles. I'm not aware of the latest situation in Shenzhen, but during my time as secretary, actually there's no such model. And some of the models available in Shenzhen, they were actually put on trial in Hong Kong by the local bus companies, and they proved to be not really effective because of the hillscape of Hong Kong. And most buses in Hong Kong, franchise buses, they are double-decker buses, unlike in many other countries. So therefore, unless we have sort of viable models, there is a major constraint there. But I'm sure in due course, technology will solve that problem. So once the technology problem is solved, then the question is whether in terms of policy, whether in terms of sort of financial commitment, whether the will is there. Now, I think it's time that government should move into a stage that, okay, we have this target, and because technology is there and the money we are willing to spend, and I think things will be solved in a smoother way. But still, there is this handicap, based on my experience, that because in terms of transport, because government is only the regulator, so it was, at least in the old days, it was natural that the regulating agency, whichever department involved in regulation, they only look at how to regulate when the product is already in the market. I see. For example, automatic vehicles, because Hong Kong is not a place to manufacture these products. It's at the receiving end. Now, if you are a manufacturer, then perhaps during the time of manufacturing, you begin to think about how to regulate, how to come up with suitable regulation. But because you are not the manufacturing base, you're at the receiving end. So once the product is in the local market, then you begin to think, okay, the old policy or the framework or the legislative framework cannot catch up with this new product. Now, if you start to think about how to change policy, how to change regulation, you are behind the scene. So the capacity to anticipate, that's the fourth L, which I talked about in my presentation. The capacity to think ahead, to look ahead, I think is very important now.
Excellent. Maybe let's see the other question. Maybe I'll just ask one more around, there was a question around, you mentioned, Anthony, just now that governments or regulators here used to think that we will only regulate if the product is in already the market. With many of these smart city initiatives, the product is not hardware, right? I mean, these are software, these are business models, these are ways of, processes. And in this respect, I think this is Christine's point also, the government cannot afford to take too much of a backseat. It needs to be out front, right, driving the development and deployment of these software solutions. And then Chris's presentation spoke about some of the trust issues involved. Do you think that, and this is a question for all three of you, do you think that the pandemic might change people's underlying attitudes to these to smart cities more generally? Because in many ways, we've seen in the pandemic how critical some of these software solutions were in trying to limit or suppress the spread of the coronavirus. Do you think it has fundamentally altered people's attitudes, or do you think once we are past the pandemic, we'll go back to our usual skepticism of big government?
I think the pandemic helps in the sense that it sort of impresses upon people that we have a new normal, that we have to do things in a very different way. All habits have to move aside. But there is always this laziness or complacency on the part of people. I mean, that's part of human nature. And it could be so easy for people to try to get back to business as usual, old business as usual. So if government really wants to take advantage of this so-called post-COVID environment or mindset, then government must be quick to seize this opportunity, because the opportunity can come and go. Yeah. But there still remains this big issue of legitimacy or trust. I think Chris was right. The more trust government can get or be confident of getting, I suppose the more willing the government is to act in a firmer way as a driving force. Because if you don't have a good sense of your support base, you'll be more reluctant to push things in a stronger manner. I think that affects the government's determination. And if we are really able to transit from the previous sort of neither fish nor fowl or less proactive mode of governance to a more proactive, more sort of steering way of governance, I think we have also to sharpen our tools. Because in the old days, when government was in a more passive mode, our agencies, our bureaucrats or civil servants, for example, they were not used to take up a more steering, a more active role, because they were not skilled. Skilled in the sort of the philosophical way to intervene. Sometimes they may be worried about picking the wrong winners. So they have to also learn how to intervene in a smart way, instead of just pumping money into areas that prove to be ineffective.
Christy, you want to chip in on that question of trust and legitimacy in a post-pandemic world?
Well, there's obviously a very important need in Hong Kong to rebuild trust, also within society, not just between society and the government, because we are split, because we have different, people think they have different values and so on. But I want to say is, what is the narrative that we can use? Because you need, you need something to steer a discussion. And if the world is adopting net zero, and we have a date with destiny, 2050, then I think this is a better narrative to start these discussions than, for example, about well-being or about smart city. Yeah. Because, as both Chris and Anthony have asked, well, smart city, what kind of smartness, for whom and why? But I think people are not going to argue so much about net zero if people accept it as an existential threat, and everybody is talking about how to do it. So I'd like to think that this is one of those things, because it has a target, it has a timeline that is globally and nationally relevant and agreed upon. Can we use that as our galvanizing narrative?
Thank you very much. Chris, I'll let you have the last word.
Got it. Thank you. It's a very interesting question. So I think the first answer to that would be we'll see, because we do have a bunch of data on government trust or public trust in government response to COVID-19 that we're processing. So hopefully we'll get that written up and published. But yes, it brings up very interesting issues in the science and policy interface. And one of the questions I'm asking going forward is, can we assume that trust in smart cities or trust in technology is coterminous with trust in government? My sense is that in both the smart cities cases I've looked at and in the COVID cases I've looked at, that citizens are able to place trust in certain policy interventions, even certain technologies, et cetera, but that does not necessarily mean that their broader trust in government is improved. I think that and to what degree can kind of the technocratic aspect of the smart cities or smart city policies sort of depoliticize policies, where people can say, well, okay, I may not agree with the Hong Kong government or may not feel like I trust the Hong Kong government, but I recognize that this pathway, this kind of solution is, in my own estimation, is a wise way to move forward, and thus I'm going to comply with it or agree with it or submit to it, et cetera. But in terms of what COVID did, just how acute and widespread, it's been almost an unprecedented crisis in kind of our modern era. I think more than anything, it expresses not necessarily probably a trend of changing how people feel about government, perhaps just deepening existing feelings about government. I mean, if we talk about ideology as kind of the currency of politics and the opportunism that many leaders have taken in democratic settings to try to gain political purchase from how they interpret the response or how they interpret the crisis, how they respond to it. I think that, no matter what the issue comes along, there's a way to read that issue or to interpret that issue that will further deepen people's political commitment to one ideology or the other. If you were inclined to trust government, you may feel even more inclined now to trust government because this situation has given government an opportunity to act quickly and decisively. On the other hand, if you're inclined to distrust government, then you will read into the situation, elements of distrust, even into the COVID-19 response, et cetera. So I kind of see it a little bit more pessimistically, but again, the data will have to bear that out.
Okay, on that note about how people are not always rational, but they're certainly rationalizing creatures. They look for evidence to support their pre-existing views. But also, I like Christine's point about how, one way of rebuilding trust within, not just between government and society, one way of rebuilding trust within society is to build a narrative around carbon neutrality. And how that's something I think where we can find a lot more common ground, and maybe starting from that, perspective, we can deepen trust and increase government effectiveness in our, longer term goals towards sustainable development and a more sustainable Hong Kong. So on that note, thanks everyone for your participation. I want to thank especially our speakers. Obviously, Professor Anthony Chung, Professor Christine Loh, and Professor Chris Hartley, as well as for our participants who woke up on an early Saturday morning and tuned in. So thank you, everyone. We will see you at the next policy dialogue. All the best, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.